All right. Atoms. So as we discussed in Lecture 1, the lowest level of complexity that we study with biology is atoms. We don't go deeper than that. That's for physics and whatnot. But in nature, you don't deal with energies that cause atoms to interact in such ways that they split up into their smaller constituents and into quarks and muons and other things of that sort. So this lecture is going to be all about answering one big question. Why do atoms interact with one another to form larger complex structures, which we call molecules? Because as we've discussed, molecules such as water and organic molecules such as carbohydrates and fats, those are going to be the next few lectures. So it's important that we understand why atoms interact with one another in various ways, or maybe why don't they interact with one another, as we'll show. Within these, the answers are various theories and principles you're going to learn, which is why in Lecture 2 we discussed the difference between a hypothesis, theory, and principle. Okay, so you can see the periodic table. Everybody's pretty familiar with this. You can see many of the elements. Some of them are not shown here because they would have their own separate rows down below. But usually anything over 92, or after the 92nd element, is pretty much man-made. So there are about 92 naturally occurring elements that exist on our planet. Well, where were those elements first created? They're created in the stars. Stars are reactors that compress hydrogen and helium into more dense atomic structures with higher weight to them and therefore different properties. And so pretty much the naturally occurring elements come from stars. They go supernova, they disperse these atoms throughout the universe, and that's what forms the galaxies and the planets and the moons and everything else. Well, we're not so concerned in biology about every single element. You're going to see a lot of them as we go through here, especially ones that play a particular role to you and I, such as calcium and sodium and potassium and things of that sort that are necessary for our body to be able to function. But when you really break it down, there are 6 fundamental elements, and we went over these before, but we'll go over them again, that all living things have. And I like the mnemonic schnapps. In fact, most of them are right here on the periodic table. These 5, and then hydrogen, which is way over there. So schnapps are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and then hydrogen. Those are the 6 elements that no matter which living organism you dissect down and break it down into its fundamental elements, you will find all 6 of those. So these are the 6 basic elements or atoms that make up all of life. Now obviously there's more to it than those 6, but that's the commonality in all living things, is they have these 6 elements that form the fundamental molecular structures. So we have to discuss a little bit about chemistry and how atoms interact with one another before we can really understand the property of these higher structures, these molecules. Now, this is going to be a small crash course in chemistry if you haven't taken it in a while, or even if you have taken it, there are things you're going to learn that you won't have learned in chemistry because of how they apply to biology. So don't turn your brain off just because you're like, I know about covalent bonds and things like that. Guarantee you there's new things you're going to learn that you didn't learn from your basic chemistry class. So, let's talk about matter. Let's talk about the nature of matter and energy. Because matter and energy are one and the same. How do we know this? Einstein's famous equation. Most people know it, but they don't really quite understand it. What does E equals mc squared mean? It means that matter and energy are the same thing. They're just different manifestations of it. You can turn energy into matter and matter into energy. So they are, it's a lot easier to turn matter into energy than it is to turn energy into matter, but they are interchangeable. All right, so matter is anything that takes up space. And we'll look at the smallest parts of an atom, such as the protons and the neutrons and the electrons. That's what we talk about when we talk about matter. Energy, on the other hand, is the ability to do work. And in Lecture 7, we're going to spend a considerable amount of time looking at the differences between potential energy and kinetic energy. Now, kinetic energy, this is just to give you an idea, is usually movement of certain particles, heat, light, electricity. All of these are manifestations of kinetic energy. But today, we're going to focus primarily on what we call potential energy, which is stored energy. And this is where we get into chemical bonds, or the interactions that atoms have with one another. Why do they interact with one another? Because that's what forms the fundamental chemical bonds, which there are 3 of that we will talk about today, that form all molecules. Now, not all molecules are organic, but in life, we're going to talk about all of the organic molecules and how they have their various properties, such as carbohydrates and fats and proteins. All right. Each organism, though it has the 6 same basic elements, do not have the same amount even. In some organisms, they might have a little less oxygen, a little more carbon, and whatnot, but all 6 of them are going to be there. Let me illustrate again the concept that it doesn't mean either that these 6 elements are the most abundant. For example, calcium in the human body, 2% of your matter that makes you up is calcium, but only 1.1% and 0.9% make up phosphorus and sulfur. So it's not about abundance, it's just about what is actually found there. Okay, so let's dissect this down. This will be one of your first questions, just to test you on your fundamental understanding of the nature of atoms. There's only one question on this on your test, but it's necessary just to make sure you have the fundamentals down. An atom is made up of 3 main parts. Most atoms. Hydrogen may be missing a part, but most atoms have 3 main parts. In the nucleus, or the center of the atom, are your protons and your neutrons. This is what forms the mass of the atom. So each atom has its own particular mass that is determined by the nature of the amount of protons and neutrons. The more protons and neutrons it has, the heavier it is, the heavier elements and things of that sort. In fact, that's how they are able to separate radioactive isotopes to be able to do things like uranium enrichment with centrifugation and things of that sort, because there's a difference in mass between radioactive uranium and basic uranium and whatnot. So that's what forms the bulk of matter in all of the atoms in all of your body and any organism is the neutrons and the protons. Now, the protons are what determine the properties of the atoms. Protons ultimately determine one main thing: how many electrons are surrounding the nucleus. Now, electrons are not massless, but almost. Okay, they don't have very much mass at all. But these electrons, these particles, as they travel around, they're very strange particles, because in certain instances they behave like particles, and others they behave like an energy wave. That gets more into quantum mechanics than we really need to in this class. So that's why I said that protons and neutrons are really what form the bulk of the mass of an atom, because for all intents and purposes, electrons are almost massless, though they do have mass. All right, so let's talk about protons and neutrons and why the atom's properties are determined by the number of protons and not the number of neutrons. Neutrons, as the name suggests, don't have any charge to them, but protons do. They have a positive charge to them, and as such, they attract electrons, and electrons having a negative charge, there's this interaction, so to speak. Well, the number of protons in the nucleus predetermines how many electrons are going to be surrounding it. If there's 6 protons in the nucleus, there's 6 electrons surrounding the atom. If there's 8, there's 8. Now that brings us another point as well. Each atom has what we call an isotope. That will come up on 1 or 2 questions. Not everybody will get that, but you need to know what isotopes are. So what is an isotope? Isotopes have the same number of protons, like carbon-12. That's the most abundant carbon on our planet. But there are other forms of carbon. There's carbon-13 and the more well-known one, carbon-14. So what's the difference between those atoms? Carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. They're all carbon, which means that they behave the same. They all behave like a carbon atom does. The main difference is these carbons are a little heavier slight bit heavier because they have one or two more neutrons. So, isotopes are atoms that have the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. We use this for things like carbon dating, because when an organism dies, the carbon-14 starts to decay at a very precise rate, and we can actually determine, it's not good for long term. It's only good for a few thousand years or so before it starts becoming obsolete. But carbon dating can allow us to reliably look at how long an organism essentially has been dead. We now use other radioactive isotopes that have a much longer half-life, in which we can use for radiometric dating of fossils and things in the Earth's crust. All right, so isotopes, make sure you understand. The protons are what determine the properties of the atoms. Isotopes have the same number of protons but different number of neutrons. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of atoms. That's just what atoms are made of. Now, let's address the question of why atoms interact with one another. So, some of you will get that question on your quiz, where it'll literally say, why do atoms interact with one another? Well, before we can answer that question, we have to talk about a theory. It's called valence electron shell theory. And this theory essentially describes how electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom. The reason why we're not exactly sure how electrons orbit the nucleus is because they're so small and they're so lightweight, so to speak, that we can't follow where they're going. And this is where quantum mechanics really becomes difficult, is because we cannot know precisely where the electron is and where it's going. This brings us to a principle called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And if you've watched Breaking Bad, that's why he calls himself Heisenberg. Because chemistry and whatnot. Heisenberg uncertainty principle is that the more you know about where an electron is, the less you know about where it's going. And the more you know about where it's going, the less you know where it came from. So you can know the speed, but you can't know its position at the same time. You can know its position, but you can't know its speed. So that's one of the biggest issues that we deal with, is the more we know about one aspect of the electron, the less we know about the other. It just is not possible yet to get to that. So that's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. That just describes why we don't know where exactly all the electrons are going or where they are at any given moment. However, we can take snapshots of it, and therefore we know relatively the area that the electrons are found in. And we call these valence electron shells. And that's where we get into the valence electron shell theory. So the valence electron shell theory is more than just, where are the electrons found. Again, that's the principle, Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So what is the valence electron shell theory? Well, it explains why atoms interact with one another. All atoms follow this rule. You have the nucleus of the atom. The first shell, as we call it, the closest area around the nucleus, can only hold 2 electrons. Now, we may not know exactly where those electrons are in that orbital, but we know it can only hold 2. There's 2 in that area going around somewhere. The next shell can hold 8 electrons. So, the way in which all atoms function is as it increases the number of protons in its nucleus, it also increases the number of electrons, respectively, as I mentioned. If you have 6 protons, you also have 6 electrons. So, as the electrons orbit, the electrons first fill up this shell, then any left over fill up this shell. Now, if you have more than 10, it goes to the third. And that's the extent of what we're going to do in this class, is the third one. The third one also follows this rule that it can hold 8. Now, it doesn't evenly distribute them between these. If you have 10, it doesn't do like 1 here and 4 there and 4 there. It always fills up the first, then the second, and if there's more, it goes to the third. Now, obviously, there's more and more after this, but it gets beyond what we need to cover for this class. So you're only going to go up to 3 shells, so to speak. 2 in the first, 8 in the second, 8 in the third. So if you have something like carbon, which has 6 protons in its nucleus. Here's the other thing to be wary of, because we're dealing with isotopes sometimes. Let's say I give you a question where I talk about carbon having 6 protons and 8 neutrons, like an isotope. Well, sometimes people make the mistake of saying, oh, there's 8 electrons. No, the electrons are directly correlated to the number of protons. So there's always, no matter what the neutrons are of an atom, it follows the rule of electron per proton. Okay, so in this scenario, you don't have a third shell. So it has 6 electrons. It'll put 2 in the first, and how many in the second? It only has 4 left. Now, here is where valence electron shell theory comes into play to explain why atoms interact with one another. An atom that does not have a full outer valence electron shell is considered unstable. It's not in a stable way. It needs the outermost shell filled up to capacity. There are multiple ways to accomplish this. The first way is to steal electrons from other atoms. So if carbon were to steal 4 more electrons from other atoms, then it would fill up that outermost shell and become stable. Well, it typically doesn't do that. We'll explain another way in a second how that does. Another way to become stable is to give up electrons. Sometimes atoms are so close. Let's say we have something like lithium, where it has 3 protons, and therefore it'll have 2 electrons and 1 in its outermost shell. It's much easier to get rid of that 1 electron, and now it defaults down to this first shell, and that's fine too. All it needs is a complete outer shell filled with electrons to capacity. That's valence electron shell theory, that the outermost shell must be filled to capacity for the atom to become stable. Now, some atoms are naturally stable. We call these noble elements. You know how nobility doesn't interact with the peons and things like that. I'm not kidding. These are called noble gases. So, helium, neon, argon. Let's look at these. The number above the atom tells you how many protons. Notice we're ignoring the neutrons in this. We're more concerned with the protons because of the behavior of the atom. So let's look at helium. It has 2 protons. So therefore, how many electrons does it have? 2. As such, helium will not interact with other atoms. Now, we can force it to if we cool it down enough to like negative 271 degrees Celsius, okay? Absolute zero, like where there's actually no movement or energy, is negative 273 degrees Celsius, so pretty close. You slow them down enough that you can actually start forming liquid helium, so to speak. They interact with one another, but it has to get freaking cold for that to occur. So helium, you don't get helium structures interacting with one another, or helium interacting with other atoms, because it's a noble gas. Let's look at neon. Neon has 10 protons. So how many electrons does it have surrounding it? It has 10. All right. How many in the first shell? How many electrons in the first shell? 2. How many in the second? It's stable because the outermost shell is filled to capacity. It has 8 electrons in it. Let's look at argon. Has 18 protons. So how many electrons does it have in the first shell? 2. How many in the second? And how many in the third? These are the noble gases. They do not interact with other atoms. And the same thing is true for these, but again, this goes beyond what we need to for this class. That means that all other atoms are unstable. And the only way they can become stable, according to valence electron shell theory, is to do something to fill up their outermost shell. So I told you about one aspect. They can lose electrons, like lithium and sodium usually do. They can steal electrons, like oxygen, fluoride, and chloride typically do. Or and this is where we get into the idea of larger structures, they can share electrons. And when they share electrons, they form tight, strong bonds that cause them to form larger structures called molecules. And that's really the idea here. So let's look at this. You're going to have a question on valence electron shell theory. Actually, two questions. One will ask you to fill up the shells based upon information I give you regarding what's in the nucleus of the atom. Okay? So as you can see, as I mentioned, hydrogen's one of those, the most naturally occurring element. Hydrogen doesn't even have any neutrons, but that doesn't matter because it has a proton. Hydrogen pretty much is just a single proton. Carbon, notice we're not showing the neutrons here, but carbon has 6 protons, nitrogen 7, 8 for oxygen. You can see how the valence electron shells fit. If you've got these little circles, that means it's a vacancy. It's missing 2 to become stable. So that's what you're observing here is this needs 3 to become stable, carbon needs 4 to become stable to fill up that outermost shell. All right, so let's do a sample question. Everyone will have one like this on your quiz, but there are a variety of different circumstances, different atoms that I'm going to give you, but the overall structure of it is exactly the same. So these are just several examples showing you. These are the 6 elements that are in all living things, so that's why they're shown here, and it illustrates the filling up of valence electron shells with the electrons, showing the vacancies. So let's talk about how atoms may steal or lose electrons. This deals with the formation of what we call ionic bonds. Okay, so there are 3 types of bonds you're going to learn today. Ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. Most or the 2 out of these 3 have a major role in biology. But as we'll learn, ionic bonds don't really form that much in any biological system. They do on occasion, but for the most part they don't. And the reason for that is because ionic bonds are strong until you put them in water, and then they get broken up very easily. Well, guess what? All living things are made up of somewhere between 70 to 90% water. So ionic bonds don't really form in living cells and living organisms because of that. Because we're mostly water. If you've ever seen a cadaver, they're much smaller and shorter than they were in real life. Why? Because they're missing most of the water that made them up. You know, they're desiccated or whatnot. So they're like 4 foot, you know, where they used to be 6 foot and whatnot. Okay, so ionic bonds. Let's talk about that. First, before we get to ionic bonds, let's talk about how an ion forms. An ion is a stable, well, for the most part, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here. An ion is an atom that has gained or lost electrons. So here's what happens. When there is a disproportion to the number of protons to electrons, then, like basic math, if you have 11 and then negative 10, you end up having a net of 1. Or if you have something like 17 protons and you have more electrons, then you have a net of 1, but on the negative side. An ion is an atom that typically has lost or gained electrons to try to become stable. So, sodium and chloride are 2 prime examples of this. Sodium has 11 protons to it. As such, it has 11 electrons. Well, let's fill up the shells. How many in the first? 2. How many in the second? 8. How many in the third? 1. What's easier? To get 7 more electrons to fill up that third shell, or to dump that one off and just default down to this one? Dump the one off. So sodium loves to give up that electron, but as a result of becoming stable, it no longer has the same proportion of protons to electrons and therefore becomes positively charged. Chloride, on the other hand, does the opposite. It has 17 protons, so therefore 17 electrons, 2 in the first, 8 in the second, and 7 more in the third. It just needs 1 more. More than happy to take that electron from sodium, but in the process of doing so, becomes negatively charged. So these two atoms become positively and negatively charged, but they're stable, and that's really what they're after. That's what valence electron shell theory is. That's why ions form, is because sodium now is stable and chloride now is stable. But now you have two atoms that have opposite charges. Well, just like magnetic poles or any elements, when there are opposite charges, opposites attract. So this is what forms the ionic bond. An ionic bond is the attraction between oppositely charged ions. Now, just like opposites attract, like repel. So if you have two ions that are of the same charge, they are not attracted to one another, they'll actually repel. Just like two magnets, if you try to put them together, the north poles, they'll repel. They create the field that repels one another. Okay? So salt is one of the prime examples of ionic bonds. When you have sodium and chloride, they will form this lattice, a perfect square lattice structure. If you look at salt crystals, they are perfectly square because they form this structure of alternating sodium and chloride atoms that all interact with one another due to their positive and negative forces. Now, you can let salt sit there on your table for 1,000 years and it will still stay together. Okay? Ionic bonds are strong. However, the moment you put it into, say, water, they start breaking apart. And so when we describe the properties of water, you'll see why. But that's one of the weaknesses of ionic bonds, is when you put them into a watery environment, they immediately start breaking apart. Okay? So that's why ionic bonds typically don't form in human cell tissues. There are certain scenarios where you do get ionic bonding, and I'll tell you what those are later on, but you don't have salt crystals forming. In fact, if you do, you're screwed, because that means that the salt concentration is so high that your cells are probably dying. All right. Now, I got a dumb joke to tell you to help you remember this. A sodium ion walks into a bar and asks the bartender for the phone to call the police. He's all beat up and whatnot, and he tells the bartender, I've been mugged and whatnot, and as he's on the phone with the police, the bartender's asking him questions, and it's like, are you absolutely sure that, you got mugged? What happened? He's like, I was walking down, and chloride just ripped one of my electrons from me, and, and whatnot. He's just like, well, are you sure? He's like, yeah, I'm positive. All right. So, that's funny. Okay, so I tell that joke to my dad probably once every other month, and he still laughs like for 5 minutes after. But he's an electrical engineer, so he loves it. Anyway, all right, so sodium chloride salt. It's not the only type of ionic bond out there. Obviously, there are many types of ions out there, but just gives you the idea of an ionic bond. All right, now let's look at the more common type of bond that forms you and I, and that is a covalent bond. These are the strongest types of interactions between atoms. So what happens is a lot of atoms don't want to give up their electrons. And even if another atom tries to steal those electrons, it holds on to them pretty tight. As such, when these types of atoms come together, instead of ripping electrons away from one and stealing them, they just share them. But in order to share them, they have to be in close proximity to one another so that the electrons can surround and travel from one atom to the other very, very rapidly. So it requires a close association between the atoms, which is what forms the covalent bonds. As you can see with the elephants and the peanut here, they both want it. They both want it really bad. As such, it's going to be shared between them. Now, unlike this scenario, the peanut, or the electron, doesn't just sit between the atoms. It circles the atoms. So in this scenario, it's missing one of the most important elements of it. And this is the only reason why I really don't like some of these two-dimensional images, is because the electrons are not just sitting there. They're actually moving. They're moving from one atom to the next and one atom to the next. Again, we don't know exactly how, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but we do know that they are going around the atoms at the speed of light, pretty much. Okay, so let's look at carbon. Because carbon is one of those elements that forms the fundamental structure for all organic molecules, from carbohydrates to fats to proteins to your genetic material, which we call DNA. So the reason why carbon is such a key element is because, unlike some of the other elements like oxygen, carbon is kind of right at that midpoint where it has 4 vacancies in its outermost shell, but it's not like lithium where it only has, a few and it'll give away that outer one. And it's not like oxygen where it has most of the valence electron shell filled up, and so it only needs a couple more. It's right at that midpoint. So carbon can form large structures with other atoms because it has just the right amount of vacancies in its outermost shell, which is 4 in this case. So here's a simple example, methane. Methane is CH4. What happens is carbon, having 4 vacancies, needs to share electrons with other atoms it comes in contact with in order to become stable. Well, hydrogen's an interesting atom. As it only has 1 proton, it therefore only has 1 electron. Now here's the thing you have to understand about hydrogen. You can't go down to 0, to nothing. You'd be like, oh, well, why doesn't it just give up that 1 electron? No. According to valence electron shell theory, you have to at least have 1 shell. So unlike sodium, where it can lose its third and go down to its second, or unlike lithium, where it can lose its second and go down to its first, hydrogen cannot get rid of its 1 electron. So its only solution is to share another electron, because even though it only has 1 proton, it still needs 2 electrons in that first shell to become stable. All right. So where does it get it from? Well, when the hydrogens come in close contact with the carbon, they all start sharing their electrons with one another. Carbon will share one of its electrons with each hydrogen, and hydrogens will share their electrons with carbon. As I mentioned, they're not just sitting in between the atoms. They're constantly circling them. But for all intents and purposes, carbon has 8 in its outermost shell, and hydrogen has 2. And as long as they stay in close proximity to one another and continually share these electrons, they are all stable. And that's why covalent bonds, which is the sharing of 2 electrons between atoms, that's the definition of a covalent bond, the sharing of 2 electrons between atoms, that's why they're so strong. Because if you try to pull one of those atoms away from that molecular structure, it resists it, because you're basically trying to destabilize that atom by removing it from that sharing. And that's why covalent bonds, which is pretty much what makes you, all of the connections that make all of the molecules that make you up, hold together. It takes a considerable amount of energy to break that. Now, yes, you can break a covalent bond. In fact, if we couldn't, you and I wouldn't be here. That's what we do when we eat. We are breaking the covalent bonds from our food to extract the energy, because there's a lot of stored energy in covalent bonds. So when you eat sugars and fats, there's just long strings, especially with fat, long strings of carbon that can be broken up, and the energy can be extracted from those covalent bonds. So a covalent bond is usually indicated by a dash between 2 atoms. Here you're seeing the valence electron shell model, but in future times you'll see it like this, where the atoms will have a single dash between them. Now a double dash means that there's 2 covalent bonds, and that's because they're sharing 4 electrons between each other. So here, carbon is sharing 4 electrons with oxygen, 2 with nitrogen, and 2 with that carbon. So it's sharing all 8 of its electrons in its outermost shell between these atoms. so that this can be stable and that one, and that's what forms that molecule or whatnot. Now, this brings us to another point of what you're going to be tested on. You will be tested on covalent bonds as well, so let me recap. Covalent bonds are the strongest bond. There is a question on your quiz that will test you relative strengths. It will say which is the strongest bond, which is strong but can be easily broken in water, or what's the weakest type of bond. We haven't talked about the weakest one yet. So, covalent bonds. Also, another thing you got to know about covalent bonds. It's not just sharing of electrons, but due to the nature of the sharing, it stores energy. This is a critical aspect for biology, because this means that the larger the molecule, the more energy is stored. That's why pound for pound, fats have more energy than sugars, because condensed in the space that the fats take up, there are more covalent bonds. As such, it's more dense, has more energy that you can get from that. And your body likes the carbohydrates more because it's easier to break down, but there's more energy in fats than there is in sugars. Okay. Now, another thing to bring up. The more covalent bonds a molecule has, so now we're getting into molecules. I mean, it's not the molecule lecture, but as atoms interact with one another and share electrons, they form more complex structures called molecules. Now, there are some molecules that are very simple, like ethanol. There are others that are more complex, like caffeine. There are different elements like nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and whatnot. But the more covalent bonds per molecule, the more energy that molecule has. Now, one of the biggest things that confuses people is I'll ask something of the nature of between a single acetylene molecule and a caffeine molecule, which one has more stored energy? And most people choose the acetylene because they're used to the idea that due to the fact that when you break this triple covalent bond of acetylene, yeah, you get a lot of energy. However, to be able to create that energy, you don't just break one, you're breaking billions of these triple covalent bonds. Well, due to the nature of caffeine, you can't really do that due to the chemical structure. However, if you were to simultaneously break all of these covalent bonds in caffeine compared to the single acetylene, you would have a much larger release of energy. Now, it doesn't happen chemically. So the concept is there's more stored energy in a single caffeine molecule than there is in a single acetylene molecule. And that's where people tend to get confused. They're like, no, we use acetylene torches and all that kind of stuff. That's because these are very easy to break billions of these molecules in an instant and release a tremendous amount of energy. If you did the same thing with caffeine, the same quantity, I'd say look out. I mean, because it's a considerable amount of energy. So the more covalent bonds that a molecule has, the more energy a molecule has. When you look at something like a sugar molecule, like glucose, that's glucose. There, that's glucose. What does a fat look like? Actually, it goes about 3 times more of that, and so on and so forth. You can start to see why fats have more energy to them per molecule, per triglyceride, than sugars do per glucose or whatnot. So, all right. Let's see. Now, let's get to the last and final type of bond. James bond. Strongest. No. Actually, I have that as one of my dummy questions, so please don't choose it. You know, what's the strongest type of bond? And I have James down there. All right. Electronegativity. Each atom has its own attraction for electrons. Now this gets, again, into more of the particulars that you don't need to know the actual electronegativity of an atom. But it needs to be brought up so you understand the next concept. Every atom has a particular pull or attraction for electrons. The stronger that pull, the more likely that atom is to rip the electrons from another atom. For example, look at chloride here. It has a very strong attraction for electrons. Look at sodium. It has a very weak attraction for electrons. As such, when you put these two together, that's why the chloride rips the electron from the sodium, and they're both happy because they're stable, though they become ions. When you deal with something more like carbon and hydrogen, they're about equal. I know it doesn't look so on there, but for all intents and purposes, they're about equal, which means that when they share their electrons, then they're equally sharing them between one another. However, when you start dealing with something like oxygen and hydrogen, like H2O, there's a difference. You no longer are sharing the electrons equally. When oxygen and hydrogen form a covalent bond, which they do, it's not the same as the covalent bond between a carbon and a hydrogen. Okay, so let me explain the difference. Oxygen and hydrogen, any sharing of electrons is considered a covalent bond. However, if the sharing is unequal, we call it a polar covalent bond. So why do we call it a polar covalent bond? It's because polarity is when, due to the unequal sharing of electrons between the atoms, you end up getting slight charges on the atoms. It's not ionic, but it does create what we call a polarity. So let's look at oxygen and hydrogen here. Due to the strong attraction that oxygen has for electrons, the electrons will spend more of their time in the valence electron shells of oxygen than they will of hydrogen. Well, just as we discussed, when you start getting that imbalance between the number of electrons and the number of protons, it starts becoming negatively or positively charged. So it doesn't actually steal the electron from hydrogen, but due to the fact that it has a stronger affinity for it, the oxygen ends up having a slight negative charge to it. Slight. And so we usually put something like that in it. Hydrogen, as a result as well, having less attraction for the electron, it spends less time around it, and it ends up having a slight positive charge to it. Well, this is where H2O comes into play. So the attraction between the hydrogen and the oxygen, or the electrons that are being shared, those are what we call polar covalent bonds. Now, for all intents and purposes, they're a covalent bond, just like any other. However, due to the unequal sharing, it causes the atoms to become slightly charged. Slightly, not immensely, but just slightly. And that leads us to our third and final bond, which is called a hydrogen bond. Now, this is probably one of the most difficult ones to explain because people it's hard to wrap your head around why we call it a hydrogen bond. Let me first explain what a hydrogen bond is, and then we'll tell you why we call it a hydrogen bond. Now, let me simplify this a little bit. So we have an oxygen and two hydrogens. The hydrogens have a slight positive charge to them. The oxygen has a slight negative charge to it. When you have two polar molecules, like water, due to its polarity, there is an attraction similar to an ionic bond, but not as strong. As such, this weaker attraction is called a hydrogen bond. Okay? So, opposites attract. We know that, just like with the ionic bonds. However, due to the fact that these are not ions, they're just slightly charged, then there's a weaker attraction between them. All right? And these hydrogen bonds are very transient, which means they're constantly being broken and remade. The water molecules are constantly moving around one another. So there is a slight attraction to each other, a very weak attraction to each other. It's not as solid as an ionic bond. It's not as strong as an ionic bond. Far from it. It's one of the weakest. So that polarity of the molecules is what creates the hydrogen bond. Now, before you imagine that water is the only one that creates hydrogen bonds, let me show you Let me show you where else hydrogen bonds are found. So let me show you water here, because that's our next lecture, is on the properties of water. And in fact, the majority of the properties of water are due to hydrogen bonding, this weak attraction between the polar molecules. You'll notice that they're constantly breaking and moving. That's what liquid water is. The molecules are always breaking and remaking new hydrogen bonds. So it's weak. But when you collectively get trillions of water molecules together, then they stay enough with one another that it forms the liquid that makes life possible, or H2O. But DNA, which is your genetic material, also has its properties due to hydrogen bonding. The majority of your DNA is held together by covalent bonds, but the inner workings, the two parts of your DNA that actually form this double helix, are held together by hydrogen bonds. That's what creates the double helix of your DNA. Proteins, which pretty much make you. Yes, the atoms are held together by covalent bonds, but due to the polarity of this molecule, then it starts forming these loops and helixes that are created because of hydrogen bonding. Otherwise, you just have these flat molecules, these very linear molecules. But due to hydrogen bonding, it creates loops and whirls, and that's what gives proteins their shape and their function. So, when we get to organic molecules, you'll start to see its application. But you've got to, for this quiz at least, you basically have to know the differences between covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonds.